Now, Amnesty International, of course, the international human rights organization, its reputation precedes it, has issued a devastating report which concludes that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. It's a exceptionally detailed, legally founded, legally precise document. It's very important to make that clear. I suppose often those who have been apologists for the hideous onslaught against the Palestinian people have attempted to almost suggest that genocide has been used as a kind of moralistic term, an imprecise term. But this is about the law. It's about what the international law says. It's about legal definitions, and how that, of course, is reflected, how that reflects the hideous suffering that the Palestinian people are currently suffering. I'm really delighted to be joined by Kristine Beckerle, who is a lawyer, a researcher, who worked on this formidable piece of work which has just been released. And it's great timing because, understandably, predictably, this report has come under a huge amount of attack, including bad faith criticisms, which we can very easily address. Kristine, it's great to speak to you. You're in Amman in Jordan at the moment, aren't you?
Yes, and thank you very much for having me.
Great to see you. I just want to start actually just get it over and done with, basically, because the assault on this document has focused on the idea that Amnesty International had to redefine what genocide is in order to fit the evidence, basically, to come up with that conclusion. Just explain what this bad faith criticism is really all about and why it's nonsense.
Yeah, I will say, before we released the report, I was so nervous because I knew that there was going to be a lot of attacks once it came out. Like, I knew that was going to happen. I was so nervous there was going to be these really very difficult to respond to arguments. And then it turns out that so many of the arguments were just sort of silly, that in a way it felt like it was relieving, but in another way it was extremely upsetting, given that if these are the only arguments that you have to launch against a report that is making a finding of genocide, then why are you either arguing, why are you not sort of focusing on what's in the report? But the debate goes as follows. Basically, you've seen this kind of immediate, quick argument that Amnesty made up a new definition of genocide to be able to use the word genocide. My favorite response to this so far was someone interviewed an Irish law professor, and they asked him, has Amnesty made up a new definition for genocide? And he basically just said no. But to kind of give a more honest or kind of more in-depth answer, this report, so one thing I should say is it's not just me. This report was put together by this massive team of people, including a massive team of brilliant lawyers, in addition to the Amnesty lawyers that worked on this report. We also sent it out to external experts, including on genocide, to sort of think through, to make sure that we were really getting everything right. And you don't really need to listen to me in terms of how Amnesty approaches genocide. You can just go look at the report. And what it does is it explains that it's building and it's using the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention, which is super clear. And then it's using the findings of international courts, in particular the International Court of Justice, to understand and interpret how one applies that legal term to particular situations and contexts. The thing that everyone's kind of riled up about is what Amnesty discusses in the report is this debate over whether or not, when you say there's a finding of genocidal intent, whether or not that has to be the only intent, meaning that I only want to specifically destroy a group, but I don't want really anything else, or it can be a dual intent, meaning I want to destroy a group and maybe I also want to destroy an armed group. And basically what Amnesty does, again, following international courts, following a lot of other kind of very, very smart international lawyers, is says that when we look at genocide, we can say that so long as you can prove that there is specific intent to destroy a group, that intent can exist alongside other goals, for example, the desire to destroy an armed group. This is particularly important in the context of Gaza, and frankly in the context of any war ever, because in any war, an attacking military, a military is going to have multiple different goals, multiple different motives, will probably really want to destroy the armed group. And to say that if they want those other things, then there can not possibly be genocidal intent found, because it's not the only intent, would basically make the protections that are supposed to exist under the Genocide Convention moot when we're talking about situations of conflict and war. So what the Amnesty report does is not redefine genocide, it tries to unpack all of these things as already discussed by international courts in the context of Israel-Palestine, to explain how we're applying this legal term and how we're applying the interpretations of this legal term by international courts today.
And just to be clear, when we talk about genocide, because people have lots of ideas in their heads when they think maybe they know the answer, but just to be very precise, when we're talking about genocide, what are we saying?
Sure. So basically, you need to do two things if you want to sort of show that an actor has committed genocide. And kind of the place to go, if people are interested, is the Genocide Convention. And Article 2 just says what genocide is. But you basically need to show two things. One, you need to show that an actor committed prohibited acts under the Genocide Convention. There's a list of 5. We at Amnesty looked at 3 prohibited acts under the Genocide Convention, specifically killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, and inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group. And then the second thing you need to do is you need to show that those acts were committed with the specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a group protected under the Genocide Convention. And when I say a group protected under the Genocide Convention, that needs to be kind of a cohesive group that has particular factors. There's not really a debate whether or not Palestinians constitute a protected group. But the big kind of difference that people will point to about genocide versus, for example, other international crimes is genocide is really done against a group. So these prohibited acts are done against a group with the specific intent to destroy them in whole or in part.
A criticism of a different direction might go, what's taking so long? 14 months of this genocidal mayhem with just blood-curdling genocidal rhetoric, backed up with some of the most heinous imaginable atrocities on a daily basis. Why is it taking 14 months for Amnesty?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when I am asked this question or when I hear my colleagues ask this question, I think it's fair. Like what we've seen in Gaza over the last 14 months, but frankly, what we've seen in Israel-Palestine over the last many, many years is a stain on kind of the entire international community. But why it took us, and also, I mean, it's worth saying that Amnesty is by far not the first to make a determination of genocide post October 7th. So why did it take us so much time? It took us so much time because Amnesty takes its time when it does its research. This report, like I said, was a massive team effort. We did deep dive research on, for example, airstrikes. We did deep dive research on conditions of life. We wrote to the Israeli authorities multiple times. And we wanted to be absolutely sure that we knew exactly what we were saying in every single piece of this report. And we also wanted to be absolutely sure that if we were going to make a determination of genocide, and if we were going to make it in this way with this strong of a conclusion, that we were ready to do it and we were completely certain of what we were putting out into the world. And do I wish that we sort of, I don't know, could have responded or could have moved faster? Maybe, but also maybe not, because I wouldn't have wanted us to come out until we were ready with the amount of research that we had and the amount of detail that we had, because I feel like it makes the argument stronger.
Let's just talk about intent and the question of intent. And, you know, I interviewed towards the beginning of the genocide, Raz Sigal, who's an Israeli-American associate professor of genocide and Holocaust studies. And he said it's very rare for intent to be so loudly spoken. I mean, he came out to talk about genocide very early on. We're talking the days after the 7th of October. And the reason he did that was because of the expressions of intent. Because although terrible atrocities were committed from the very beginning against the people of Gaza, you know, the vast majority of them obviously happened since he made that determination. And I just want to give one example. And this was Major General Ghassan Alian. He is the Israeli Army Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, COGAT. He's in charge of civilian affairs of the IDF, for those who don't know. And on the 9th of October, a video statement was released by COGAT's Twitter account. It was specifically addressed to Hamas and the residents of Gaza. Very important point. Because he then said, Hamas became ISIS, and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human beasts are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade on Gaza, no electricity, no water, just damage. You wanted hell. You will get hell. Now, there's no pretense there about the demarcation of military targets and the civilian population. Collective guilt of the civilian population is pronounced. collective punishment is pronounced, including the siege of all the basic, the basic needs of life. No water. I mean, come on. I mean, is this just, do you think actually, I mean, even the fact we have to discuss this when actually, I've just mentioned one statement, but there are so many statements from Israeli politicians, generals, army officers, political, soldiers, media organizers. I mean, it's relentless. I mean, do you think that's actually quite rare for this to be so overtly spoken? Because Raz Segal said to me, normally states go to great lengths to suppress this kind of intent.
Yeah, I think one thing that I never thought I would be saying about a report that I worked on, but I will say it because it's true. One thing that has been kind of startling to me, but also not that startling to me, is that after the report came out, just presenting it to people, like, for example, journalists or advocates or civil society people or even bureaucrats, we're not really telling anybody stuff they don't already know. Like, that's the kind of thing, back to your point about 14 months. So when Amnesty looked at, like, the thing with this genocide is Amnesty is providing a 300-page report where we really worked really hard to kind of know every single thing that we were putting forward and sort of put it into a framework that helped people think through how genocide applies to what's been happening in Gaza. But this has all also been live streamed. And also you have all these Israeli officials putting statements online in English and Hebrew, making these extremely dehumanizing statements. You have Israeli officials who are not just kind of random officials, but officials who directly have a say in what is happening in Gaza, making these sorts of statements over and over and over again. And so, yes, does it sort of feel like then when I say, well, let me walk you through my 300-page report as to how we determine genocide, and then the person is in front of me is sort of saying, well, yeah, okay, sure, where have you been? It makes me, I will say, feel both more stronger about the fact that we did this, because obviously it needed to be done, but also I would say more despairing, because the fact that we did this and it's been 14 months and it's ongoing and the major arms suppliers are still selling weapons, it kind of leaves us all in this world where there's a whole set of people who have been paying attention and kind of know the things that we are putting forward, how they've been happening, that they've been happening with the specific intent to destroy Palestinians in whole or in part. And then a whole set of actors who are continuing to contribute to either arming the Israeli military or defending or blocking accountability efforts. And they're not budging. And so I think the hope for Amnesty with this report was not necessarily, I think, to provide some secret information that people who were paying attention didn't know about, but to say, okay, we're going to put all this together. We're going to look at what's been happening over the last 14 months. We're going to very carefully analyze it under international law, what it says on genocide, and we're going to put forward our determination. And the hope was that by doing so, we would contribute to the efforts that were trying to just keep pushing on the actors that were continuing to try to deny again, but it's sort of in front of everybody's faces.
Do you think, I mean, in terms of when we're discussing this genocide, if we go back to the request for arrest warrants for war crimes and crimes against humanity, as of yet, not genocide. This is the International Criminal Court, of course. By the and these have of course been issued against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. Very important to say that further charges are extremely likely to be forthcoming. That could end up including, of course, genocide, and they don't have to be publicly made. These could be, they didn't have to make the arrest warrants public in the first place, and they could end up, almost certainly will, of course, against other people as well. Now, what they said in, and they what I thought was quite an interesting statement in the original request for arrest once by Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, is he talked about the acts, the war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that he was focusing there on starvation for three reasons. In terms of the purpose. And he said one of them was collectively punish the civilian population of Gaza, whom they perceive as a threat to Israel. Is that basically the critical point? Israel's position is the existence of the Palestinian people is an existential threat, and they work backwards from that. And there are constraints that come, because, you know, one of the bad faith criticisms you get is if Israel wanted to commit genocide against the Palestinians, they could have done that on the 8th of October, as if any genocide in history has ever been committed within 24 hours, because genocides are a process, aren't they? They're a dynamic process, not in a positive sense, but they have a logic of their own. So what do you think of that? Is basically Israel has constraints upon it. It can't just go out and just murder everyone in that sense. It has, international pressure is not anywhere near what it should be, but that is pressure. What do you think about that? Do they basically work backwards from that point with the other with various constraints they have to navigate, is what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, no, totally fair. And let me use that actually to kind of walk you through a little bit how we thought about genocidal intent in kind of more detail, because I think it goes to that question, and I also think it goes to this question of time frame, basically. Because when we were looking at genocidal intent, we were looking at statements like the statement that you read out, and that's kind of part of the analysis, just what were high-level Israeli officials that could determine what was happening in Gaza saying. And Amnesty looked at more than 100 statements, identified more than 20 statements by people who, again, had a significant amount of power over Gaza, making genocidal statements. Also looked at statements, for example, made by guys who were fighting in Gaza, celebrating destruction, this kind of thing, maybe echoing statements by their leaders. So that's like one piece of the analysis, but another piece of the genocidal intent analysis is looking at patterns of conduct. And in that analysis on the patterns of conduct, in that analysis, the genocidal intent actually does become clearer as time passes. And the reason I'm saying it becomes clearer as time passes is because if you just took a teeny tiny snapshot of, for example, humanitarian access to Gaza for, say, 1 week. And COGAT does this all the time, right? They'll sort of say like, oh, look, but in this week, more trucks entered Gaza than entered Gaza before October 7th. So thus, we are not causing starvation, and thus we are not committing genocide, and thus everything's fine. But that's not actually how you do an analysis like this, because then you say, okay, well, COGAT, how many trucks have entered Gaza since October 7th? And if you look, there are times when it goes up, and then there's times when it crashes right back down. Or you say, okay, COGAT, or not COGAT, the Israeli military, you're saying, we didn't actually mean to kill all of those civilians when we bombed this residential house, or that residential house, or that residential house. But if you look over time and they keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, knowing what the outcome is going to be, and not just knowing because they're people and they can figure it out, but because everyone is telling them exactly what the outcome is going to be and they keep doing it, those types of patterns of conduct help us think through genocidal intent. And I think it would have been harder, frankly, in October or November to make a patterns of conduct argument. But then when we're looking now 14 months and we can say, okay, yes, you allowed more aid in April, but then right after you attacked Rafah and devastated the aid response and attacked the place where you told everybody to flee, I think when you look at things in that totality and over time, that's when things start becoming much clearer about the constraints that Israel is in fact operating under, but the ways in which it is continuing to kill, seriously harm, and inflict destructive conditions of life on Palestinians despite those constraints.
Let's talk about prohibited acts. So killing and causing serious harm, for example. I mean, do you want to talk about that? Again, when we say prohibited acts, it's probably quite obvious to people, it might not be. Let's talk about, when we talk about prohibited act, what we're talking about, and then let's talk about killing and causing serious harm, how that fits in.
Sure. Yeah. So basically, for anybody who's listening and interested, this is chapter 6 of the report. But basically, like I said, for the way we did it is we broke down the analysis into looking at the prohibited acts, so i.e. the acts that are prohibited under the Genocide Convention that Israel carried out in Gaza, and then looking at the specific intent, and that's chapter 7 of the report, and trying to see what are the indicators, what are the ways in which we can infer and determine whether or not Israel had the specific intent to destroy Palestinians. Again, both of which you need to say Israel is responsible for genocide. But on the prohibited acts, basically I'm going to break that into 2 parts, and I'll go short. If there's follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer them. But the first one is killings and serious bodily injuries. And that, perhaps unsurprisingly for anybody who's kind of, again, been paying attention, what we did was we looked at airstrikes and Israel's aerial campaign. In particular, Amnesty did a deep dive on 15 airstrikes that Israel had conducted just between October 2023 and April 2024. All 15 were either direct attacks on civilians and civilian objects or indiscriminate attacks on civilians. These 15 alone killed 334 people, including 141 kids, wounded hundreds of others. All of them hit civilian objects. In all but one case, Israel gave no warning. In the one case it did give a warning, it wasn't effective. Our colleagues really, really looked trying to find a military objective or a military target in or near the location struck in all 15. In none of the cases did they identify a military target. These strikes obviously are only a tiny fraction of Israel's overall attacks in Gaza. One thing that has haunted me is a Palestinian doctor told Amnesty that they had to dedicate an entire day a week just to amputations, and that most of the amputations were the result of injuries caused by explosive weapons, where amputations was the only option. And kind of like I was saying before, viewed alone, like one of these attacks, two of these attacks, three of these attacks, maybe you could argue Israel is being reckless or negligent or whatever. But when you look at them together, and you see these patterns of merging that Israel is just doing over and over again in terms of the types of weapons it's using, in terms of what it's striking, in terms of hitting residential homes at night when large extended families are going to be gathered, including in places where they've all been displaced too. Remembering that Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world before October 7th and post October 7th, everything's become much more tightly packed together because of forced displacement. It begins to indicate deliberateness. And I think you also have to remember that Israel claims to be one of the most technologically advanced military in the world. And this isn't Israel's first foray into Gaza, right? The Israeli military has been engaged in combat operations in Gaza many times over the last 10, 15 years. And when you talk to Palestinians in Gaza, when you talk to humanitarians working in Gaza, when they talk about what's happened since October 7th versus these other wars that they've lived through, they say it is something entirely different. And anyways, that's how, based on that work, Amnesty determined that Israel was committing these two prohibited acts, killings and serious bodily injuries. I'll stop there because that was a long answer, but I'm happy to speak about
really important answer. And I guess, evidence is always coming out, and a new report by Air Wars, an NGO which focuses on aerial bombardment, they looked at the first 25 days of the bombing campaign in Gaza. They found in October alone, 2023, at least 5,139 civilians were killed, of which at least 1,900 were kids. And they said they looked at 606 incidents involving civilian harm. And they said, whilst over 5,000 civilians were killed, between 30 and 58 militants were killed. So therefore, 99.4% of incidents involving civilian harm killed civilians, with 0.6% killing militants. It's important. I have to say, I'm glad. I was going to say we shouldn't be shocked, but we should never stop being shocked to this. It's something I tell myself every day. You never, ever let yourself stop being shocked by this. But you look at that, and that just looks like extermination.
Yeah, I think it's funny because our analysis, in the report, we actually focus much more on this third prohibited act, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about, which is kind of the shorthand version of that is the slow death prohibited act. But I was very glad that we included the airstrike analysis, and I'm frankly extremely glad that there are organizations like Air Wars that take this sort of longer term, more data point view, because Amnesty looked at 15, and Air Wars looks at this much wider data set, and I just think that when you talk to people about what has happened in Gaza over the last years, the air war and the way in which the air war has been fought has just been so devastating. And I think, again, it's one of those things where we can issue our report, Air Wars can issue our report, but anybody who's sort of doubting the extent of this, I just recommend they go look at the videos of, for example, North Gaza these days and just how much has been destroyed and flattened.
A really important point, which obviously you talk about in the report, obviously goes into detail, is, even in, frankly, military onslaughts, which are intense, but nowhere near as intense and as concentrated as this, the biggest killer is not violence, it's indirect causes. And as an example, in Britain, if every single hospital was suddenly blown up, that would impose a terrible death sentence on a very large number of people, even without the intense poverty and much of the country, or the country being reduced to rubble. That's the point, isn't it? It's about the conditions of life that you talk about. It's about, we can talk obviously horrible violent deaths, bombing, bullets, the various weapons that Israel has used. But the biggest means of killing will be the other indirect consequences from the multi-pronged offensive.
Yeah, and I think so that kind of ended up being a real, probably one of the most significant parts of our analysis, for all of the reasons that you just laid out, but also because the speed with which, so Gaza was already experiencing a humanitarian crisis pre-October 7th, but the speed with which the situation of the entire population deteriorated was, for lack of a better word, horrifying. And I think as part of this work, Amnesty did interviews with a bunch of different people, and that included humanitarian aid workers, it included people who had been displaced, it included farmers who weren't able to reach their agricultural land, and it included medical workers trying to provide care to literally infants and other young kids suffering from malnutrition and malnutrition-related complications in Gaza. And I just emphasize that because I will say working on this was awful, but the two things that kind of kept me and I think my colleagues going was, one, how many people in Amnesty were working on this, and two, part of the stories that you were hearing from people in Gaza were, yes, the horrific things that were being imposed upon them by the actions by the Israeli government and the Israeli military, but also the ways in which people in Gaza were still trying, despite it all, to take care of each other. And I think I will truly never forget the doctors who were trying to provide malnutrition and malnutrition-related care to literally, again, infants and other kids. Anyways, to be more precise in terms of the research, basically, I think the big thing to say here, just again to sort of take on the misinformation head on, is what critics / the Israeli government will say in response to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is basically, no, it's not our fault. Like, it's not our fault. We're doing everything we can. And what we tried to do in the report was to interrogate that and to say, okay, what is actually happening and what are the things that are contributing to this kind of horrific set of circumstances that we're seeing? And the three things we looked at were related to our previous conversation: the massive damage and destruction of critical infrastructure and other objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. So you made the point about hospitals, but also thinking about water and sanitation infrastructure, agricultural land, homes, and like across the board, the damage and destruction is really unimaginable. The second thing, which is a big part of the kind of conversation, is the repeated mass forced displacement of the vast majority, 90% of Palestinian population, under inhumane conditions over and over and over again. If you want another resource on this, Human Rights Watch just did a big deep dive on displacement. And then the third, and I say the third only because you can only think about the denial and obstruction of humanitarian aid and other essentials in the context of the mass damage and the mass forced displacement. So to give you an example of that, Kogat loves to talk about how many food trucks are entering Gaza. Cool, great. Like, food trucks definitely need to enter Gaza, but you can't talk about just the number of food trucks without also talking about the fact that Gaza's ability to produce food has basically been wiped out. And despite everything that was happening before October 7th, farmers in Gaza actually produced like a significant amount of food in the strip, including important food with important nutrients for people. And so if we're going to talk about how much food is getting into Gaza, we also need to talk about what was being produced in Gaza beforehand, how that's wiped out, and is that being replaced? And the obvious answer is no. But basically, you can sort of look at all of these different things and see the ways in which Israel's actions, policies, and omissions kind of came together to create the conditions of life that we're seeing, which, like, to put it bluntly, is most people in Gaza grappling with hunger and disease in a context in which not only has the medical system been totally decimated, but there is no real way for people to medically evacuate if they need to medically evacuate, again, because Israel is blocking the medical evacuation process. So,
That point about food, I'm so obviously it's discussed at length in the report, and such a crucial one because, you know, it's multi-pronged, doesn't it? On the one hand, you've got the serial blocking of aid trucks getting in. I mean, look, I was going to say the British Foreign Minister, former Conservative Foreign Secretary David Cameron listed ways Israel was blocking that back in the spring. Both US aid and the State Department's refugee agency confirmed in April that Israel was deliberately blocking food from getting in. But then there's the destruction of the roads. There's the destruction of law and order, and lots of evidence to suggest criminal gangs being allowed with impunity, obviously, to steal aid. That you've got internal blockades and all the rest of it. And 83% as an example of all plant life. 83% of all plant life has been destroyed. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? It's just making Gaza inhospitable for human life. That's what's happening.
Yeah, and I think we quote someone that I spoke to who has worked on sort of the agricultural sector, let's say, in Gaza for many years, and the way this person put it was they stole the ability to produce food, and I think that kind of sums it up. And I think there was this period, like, this isn't funny, but there was this period where I became really obsessed with the fact that the Israeli authorities were blocking the import of animal food or fodder into Gaza. And I became obsessed with this because if you start looking, all the agricultural inputs that you would need to sort of revive the agricultural sector are being blocked or being stopped, aren't being prioritized. And it's this one teeny tiny thing within this huge wider picture. But that just shows you kind of at every step, everywhere you look, there's some impediment, some block, some obstruction that is getting you to the situation again where the vast majority of people don't have enough food.
One thing I was suggesting all of it, but talking about the assault on cultural, religious structures, life. I mean, this is an important part of genocide, isn't it? Where you don't just erase people, but you erase their imprint on the world. And this includes religious sites which have existed for so long, but religious sites which go back many centuries. I mean, can you talk about that? How Palestinian culture is being erased from the face of the earth?
Yeah, I will say one of my low points after the report was released is I opened social media and someone had don't do it, but someone had posted a video of another controlled demolition of a mosque. And I couldn't help myself. I watched it. But it hit me because in the report, again, to sort of shift back into lawyerly mode for a second, when looking at genocidal intent, you look at whether or not these prohibited acts were committed, but you also look at whether or not other things were happening that are indicative of genocidal intent. And one of the things that we specifically look at in the report is the destruction of cultural and religious heritage, and particularly look at the destruction of cultural and religious heritage in these controlled demolitions where people are laughing, celebrating, kind of happy about the destruction. There doesn't seem to be any military threat. And again, this kind of happened again and again and again. And you put that into the context of the statements, the wider context of dehumanization. And yeah, it just sort of starts coming together to make this picture, which is why we did this report, that the only reasonable inference of what is happening is that there is genocidal intent and Israel is in fact committing genocide in Gaza.
Just, you mentioned these Israeli soldiers, and well, we've all seen this, Amnesty, Al Jazeera did an in-depth piece of work, Richard Sanders, who I've interviewed repeatedly on this channel, about, in this case, this documentary focused on the glee with which many Israeli soldiers, as you mentioned, blew things up, including libraries, universities, places of worship, cackling, laughing. We've seen all sorts of degraded, wearing women's clothes, playing around with children's toys in just obscene ways. What do you think? I'm not asking you from a moral perspective, just from a legal perspective, because again, normally speaking, states and a state engaged in genocide or war crimes and the soldiers of that state normally go to great lengths to disguise what they're trying to do. That has not happened here. What does that, do you think, tell us? That a lot of people look at and go, we're not just watching something horrible, we're watching people who think and actually kind of know they've got impunity.
Yeah, so I think I would say two things on that. Part of the reason Amnesty is kind of pushing for the ICC to, not just for the ICC to go ahead, include genocide, all of these things, but also for states to follow the arrest warrants that have been issued by the ICC, is that there is a complete dearth of accountability within Israel. And like you have had, and so we've talked about the ICC in this conversation, but the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, has an open case in front of it brought by South Africa about whether or not Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians. And as part of that case, the International Court of Justice specifically called on Israel to do everything within its power to prevent genocide, and that should include, for example, opening investigations, prohibiting incitement, all of these things. One of the things that Amnesty looks at in the report is to show has not happened. And when you have people saying the things that they're saying, posting the videos that they're posting, like, it doesn't take an expert to realize that those people are not afraid that they're then going to be drawn up on court-martial and kind of held to account for the things that they're doing. And so one of the reasons there's this kind of push for international justice, for like the role of third states, for example, in universal jurisdiction, is because it is very, very clear that that sort of accountability is not happening within Israel. And it's one of the reasons why we, again, not just focus on the ICC, but have also called on third states to pursue charges where they have sufficient evidence against people who seem to be involved, not just in genocide, but any international crimes when they're under their jurisdiction.
And just so people are clear, there's this principle of complementarity where the International Criminal Court intervenes when it is confident or has concluded that the state in question, its judiciary, is incapable of doing free and fair trials which investigate the crimes in case. And I just which have been discussed. One of the most, for me, and this is quoted in the report, and I've always thought, again, I mean, I've said this throughout, this is, in my view, the biggest scandal of modern Western journalism, in that what media coverage has consistently failed to do, with courageous exceptions, is to frame coverage around what Israeli leaders and officials said they were going to do and ordered soldiers to do. And one example, which is quoted in the report, which links to what we're talking about, was Yoav Gallant, of course, the former defense minister, who is a wanted man by the International Criminal Court. On the 10th of October, he addressed Israeli soldiers who were deployed near Gaza, and he told them, "I released all restraints." He said, "Attack everything, take off the gloves." And he goes on, he says to eliminate everything. It will take time. It won't take a day. It won't take a week. It will take weeks and maybe months. We will reach all places. He also said the next day that he's released all the restrictions on Israeli soldiers. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? I mean, again, sometimes you've seen coverage which suggests, has there been a breakdown in discipline amongst Israeli soldiers, when the defense minister, the man in charge of the Israeli army, specifically told them, you have no restrictions on you and you have no restraints. And that's a really crucial part of the whole story, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think I'll say two things. So one, like, part of what that part of the report is trying to show is, one, it really does matter what high-ranking officials are saying, particularly when those high-ranking officials, again, have the power to make decisions about what is happening in Gaza. And second, the ways in which statements, claims by these high-ranking officials then get echoed on the ground. And so I think those are the two things that part of the report is trying to show. You don't just sort of say things and then they go away. If you're the defense minister, if you're the prime minister, if you're the president, what you say matters, it resonates. And I think the other thing that part of the report is trying to show, and part of the reason the report is trying to show this, is that when back in the day, it's really not that back in the day, but at the ICJ, one of the things that was said by the Israeli side in response to the use of these statements from October was, oh, well, it was the heat of the moment. People were very upset, understandably, after the Hamas-led attacks on October 7th. So things were said. But what that section of the report really shows is that, well, actually in practice, a lot of the things that were said in October were not just then implemented in Gaza, like take this total siege as the most obvious example, but then also the things that were said in October were then echoed and implemented later on by soldiers in Gaza. And I think it's one of these things where people will say, oh, well, but like, is that really their fault? And the thing is, yes, because there's a million things that could be done to say, actually, no, there are restraints. Actually, no, we will hold you accountable if you do X, Y, or Z. Actually, no, this is completely beyond the pale of not just what international law says, but what Israeli law says. And you don't see those things. You just see the same behaviors continuing and continuing and continuing with the complete absence of accountability. And the last thing I just have to say is that this kind of world of impunity has existed for a really long time. And I think when we look at like what we're talking about this past 14 months, but when we look at the last many, many years, the impunity that has existed for what the Israeli military in particular, but Israeli authorities more broadly have done to the Palestinian people, both in Gaza and the West Bank, influences where we're at now, as does the lack of accountability that we've seen more broadly internationally against what the state of Israel has been doing to the Palestinian people. And I think I emphasize that just because you have all these kind of nerves and, oh, but can we really arrest a sitting member of the Israeli government? And it's like, are you really going to continue the path that you've been on this many years, given that this is where we are now? And I would hope the answer would be no, but let's see.
I mean, it's just one of the things I wanted to touch on. I mean, it's quoted, it's because, the Palestinian testimony is very important in the report. And the quote of which is used as the heading of the report is, "You feel like you are subhuman." And it's true, isn't it, that the prerequisite for every genocide is dehumanization, because the vast majority of human beings in any society are not sociopaths or psychopaths. That's a very small, 2% or so. Humans do have very powerful feelings of empathy and sympathy which exist, but dehumanization obliterates them. And it was really interesting, again, was that the right word? Disturbing. Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, carried a report by a serving Israeli soldier who said that the rules of engagement were prohibited the shooting of stray dogs unless the stray dog's jaws were clamped on the bodies of an Israeli soldier, but that no such prohibition existed for civilians who could be shot at will. I mean, that sums up the dehumanization, doesn't it? It's literally their lives are worth less than the starving stray dogs of Gaza.
One of the things, that we haven't talked about so much is that the report tries to put what it's looking at, which again focuses on this period post October 2023, into this much wider and longer context of the dehumanization of Palestinians. You probably don't really need me to talk you through that, but I think that when we talk about genocides, like no genocide looks the exact same, but the aspect of dehumanization and treating people as subhuman is kind of a critical part, as is, again, this intent or this animus against the particular group. And I think, it's kind of just a funny thing to sort of be in a world where not just what we've seen over the last 14 months, but like what we've seen over the last many years in terms of like an unlawful blockade. We're at year 17, unlawful occupation. We're nearly 60 years apartheid, and that we're sort of still in the world where we're trying to convince people that it's bad enough to stop selling weapons, or it's bad enough to kind of comply with ICC arrest warrants. And now we're in a world where genocide, and it's just, I don't know. I really hope the world surprises us. And by the world, I mean particular set of actors, namely the US and Germany as major weapon suppliers, also UK, obviously. I just, it's one of these things where we have the information. We don't need more information. We have the legal analysis. We don't need more legal analysis. We have the voices of Palestinians who have been speaking up for a very long time. We also have the voices of some courageous Israelis who have been speaking up. Those aren't the problems right now. The problems are political will.
In fact, I just interviewed Ofer Kasif, who's an Israeli politician, who told me he fears for his life at the moment in Israel because of his speaking out against the genocide. And just say the report talks about, international law, right to life, right to food, right to health, these systematic violations, obviously. I mean, just in terms of, you can weave in as well, just, the any parts of the report you think are really important to just to conclude, two final things, really. But I mean, in terms of accountability, this crime, a lot of people look at this and go, this crime has been so confessed to and boasted about from the top to the bottom. It has been more documented thanks to the testimonies, the work of Palestinian journalists who've been exterminated, and social media and all the rest of it, and the work of the likes of Amnesty and all the rest of it. It's rare for a crime to be so documented in so much detail, despite the fact that other journalists, foreign journalists are banned from getting in, analysts are banned from getting into Gaza. There's still overwhelming evidence. And yet, the dynamic of power, we know what the dynamic of power is. The US remains the only superpower. Israel is a state which is obviously very close to the United States. A lot of people look and think there's never going to be accountability. They're going to get away with this. They're going to get away with this obscene crime, which frankly has changed people. Many of the people who've watched what's happened have been changed forever. And they see these horrors. They see children being butchered by a state which puts on television shows, by the way, which literally debate killing children as valid military targets. And they think, how is it possible? People feel like they're going mad watching that. What do you think? Is accountability a utopian pipe dream?
Here's what I'll say. So the first thing I'll say is that I think we can, and I have looked at the past 14 months and just felt a deep pit of despair. And like, I'm someone who's done human rights for a really long time, and this hasn't been the best year plus for people who are invested in the international human rights system. But we can also look at this past year and see mass protests around Palestine across multiple cities. You can see students risking arrest to protest against genocide. You can see, frankly, Palestinian journalists keeping doing what they're doing, Palestinian doctors keeping doing what they're doing, Palestinian artists. It's, by the way, the cover of the report was done by a Palestinian artist in Gaza, carrying on. And I think when I look at all of that, I think, well, actually, if all these people can keep fighting despite the odds, then certainly I can. And I would hope that other people kind of take that inspiration away as well, because frankly, like, this only carries on. Accountability, it never happens if we all just accept that this is the state of affairs and this is kind of necessarily the way in which the world has to be. Like, our despair helps. Our despair helps the people who like impunity. Our despair helps the people who want to just say, well, this genocide happened, but let's forget it. Let's move on. And I think kind of what we owe, and I'm speaking to sort of those who care about, for example, even if Palestine is not your issue, but if you care about kind of human rights writ large, what we owe right now is to keep working, basically, because the fact of the matter is the world doesn't get better if we give up. Like, it's as simple as that. It only gets better if a whole bunch of people reject a set of unfair structures, unfair actions, unfair policies, and in this case, genocide. And like, one little thing might make the difference from one other person. And I'll give you a very specific example. Like, I've heard people say, well, but do the protests really matter? Because, you know, but the US policy hasn't changed, but the students got arrested. So does it really matter? But I'll tell you, like, personally, I live in Beirut, a lot of us were feeling a lot of despair around the time that the student protests kicked off in the US and Europe. And those happening gave us energy. It didn't just give me energy, like, it gave a bunch of my colleagues energy. And as a very, very like basic thing, if something that you are doing in solidarity with others helps give them the energy to keep going in a context where the odds are immense, like, that is something meaningful. So I can't say that that means things are going to get better immediately. I can't say that that means even that this genocide is going to stop immediately, because it is carrying on as we speak. But I can say that unless we continue, then certainly we know what the outcome is going to be. And I don't really want that outcome.
Well, and just finally, that's what I was going to end on. And it's not, I often try and end on a more hopeful note, but let's just be brutal. What is the direction of travel as things stand if there isn't drastic change? Talking about Gaza, which is a different color and texture when looked at from space because of the mass destruction of civilian infrastructure, the mass destruction of local food production, the destruction of its healthcare system, a traumatized population which has been repeatedly, forcibly, violently moved around a tiny strip of land, no bigger than East London. I mean, you know, an excess, the death rate itself, the violent death rate, the worst, as one UN official said, since the Rwandan genocide. And then there's the excess deaths, which is those dying not of the direct violence. I mean, what is Gaza? I mean, this, you know, we saw Cambodia, that went year after year after year. What are we looking at?
Well, I think just one very basic thing is I get really, really angry and annoyed when people say, well, you know, like, obviously we need a ceasefire, but a ceasefire is not enough, because frankly, like, if the blockade remains in place and if the situation, like as it is now in terms of the humanitarian crisis, something radically doesn't change to sort of help the people who are currently in Gaza, you are looking at, and I don't say this lightly, years of misery. Like, already what you lose in the first couple of years of life, if you're, for example, extremely malnourished, you don't get back. So first of all, like, the losses that have already been imposed are already unfathomable. So yes, we need a ceasefire, and we need a ceasefire right now. But after a ceasefire, you also need to allow people in Gaza to get healthcare. And how are they going to get healthcare currently? You need to allow people in Gaza to get enough food. And again, how are they going to get enough food when the entire food production system has been decimated? So when you ask the direction of travel right now is honestly atrocious. And I think if you people will count on us all kind of losing energy, being fatigued, moving on. But the people who are still currently in Gaza, living under occupation, living under a blockade, those people, this doesn't stop when we stop paying attention. So I think what I would say is that one thing that gives me you want to end on a hopeful note in terms of direction of travel, what we currently have from the International Court of Justice is we have a decision saying that Israel needs to end the occupation. You have states like Ireland considering taking action related to that. So in terms of the direction of travel, I think if nothing changes, very, very bad. But there are things that are currently happening that actually could be meaningful and could actually put important political pressure on Israel to change behavior, which I hope everyone kind of engages in what they can.
Kristine, brilliant stuff. I'll include a link in the video description for people to read. Do share it. Do share this video. Press like, subscribe, share your comments, get the word out, and rebut the bad faith critics. But Kristine, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.